we conclude that, in a field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. 2 years after these historic words were read from the U.S. Supreme Court, the majority of Southern schools still had not integrated. On September 25, 1957, in Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 ambitious high schoolers took part in an experiment to become the first black students to be integrated into an all-white high school. These students were referred to as Little Rock 9. This was 2 years after the Supreme Court Brown v. Board of Education case, which ruled that racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional. It was a demonstration of equal educational opportunities for the black community. Despite the public outrage, those 9 determined black students paved the path for future generations of black children to receive a quality education. It also demonstrated how the U.S. government was committed to integration and equality. Together, they set a higher standard of education in America for black people by making the country take responsibility for the lack of interest in the prosperity of African Americans. This was caused by the efforts and persistence of the government and the people fighting for equality, which led to the integration of schools to become a social normality, which deemed the experiments of the Little Rock 9 a triumph. The systematic racism and prejudice against black people had become a normal everyday occurrence until the 50s, when people who were fed up with the hypocritical and unfair policies began challenging the system that had kept the black community complacent for so long. The story of the Little Rock 9 began in 1951, when Planteef, Oliver Brown's daughter, Linda Brown, was denied admission into Topeka, Kansas's all-white elementary schools, and he filed a lawsuit against the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, claiming that the schools for black children were inadequate when compared to the schools provided for white children. Brown's case, known as the Brown v. Board of Education, was put forth to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they agreed that school segregation had, quote, detrimental effects upon the colored children, end quote, and had helped to create a sense of inferiority within the black community, thus calling for the desegregation of public schools. The motion to desegregate took some time to pass. However, by 1955, the school board in Little Rock, Arkansas agreed to comply with the court ruling and began strategically planning how they were to be the first school to integrate black students into their white schools. 2 years later, in 1957, the NAACP initially registered the first 36 black students to be integrated into Little Rock Central High School. However, only 9 students participated. These students were Ernest Green, Elizabeth Eckford, Jefferson Thomas, Terrence Roberts, Carlotta Walls, Minnie Jean Brown, Gloria Ray, Thelma Mothershed, and Melba Patillo, and they were set to begin attending Central High School. The media began referring to them as the Little Rock 9. The first steps taken toward desegregation didn't sit well with many Southern conservatives and conservative politicians. On September 4, 1957, when the Little Rock 9 attempted to enter the doors of Central High School for their first day, they were sadly denied entrance by the National Guard, called upon by Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus.
I will not force my people to integrate against their will.
5 days later, on September 9th, after hearing of Faubus's reluctance to allow the 9 into Central, U.S. District Court Judge Ronald Davis of Arkansas for the Eastern District filed an injunction against Governor Faubus. On September 20th, Judge Davis granted the NAACP lawyers Thurgood Marshall and Wiley Britton an injunction, telling Governor Faubus that he had to withdraw the National Guard from restricting the 9 to enter Central High School. Faubus, having no other choice, complies and follows Davis's orders, telling the National Guard to stand down. 3 days later, on September 23rd, the Little Rock police brought the 9 to Central High earlier than the normal school day was scheduled to start, in an attempt to avoid the large groups of protesters waiting outside the building. Eventually, a crowd of more than 1,000 protesters realized that the 9 were already within the walls of Central, and they began to riot. Due to the ensuing violence, the police were forced to escort the Little Rock 9 out of the building for their own safety. Due to the fact that Little Rock's police force was outnumbered, on September 24th, President Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne Division of the U.S. Army to help safely and productively escort the 9 into school. Finally, after multiple attempts, on September 25, 1957, the members of Little Rock 9 enter Central High for their first successful day of school. Then, on November 27th, after a short adjustment period, the 101st left Little Rock, Arkansas. During the 9's time at Central High School, they were all victims of physical and emotional abuse, inflicted by both the white students as well as the staff. Many people at this time had what could be deemed a traditional mindset, believing that black and white people shouldn't mix social groups, not even for something as temporary as school. This resulted in countless violent protests and aggression towards the 9. It even went as far as having the 9 students strategically placed in separate classes by school authorities in an attempt to isolate them and keep them from corroborating their abuse. Carlotta Walls Lanier, the youngest of the 9, recounts her experience at Central High School as painful. At only 15 years old in 1957, she says that going into the experiment, she had expectations of making new friends, going to school dances, and singing in the school choir. However, none of this would turn out to be true. The University of Denver magazine posted an article interviewing Lanier, and she said that during her time there, she noticed that there were 3 groups of people, the first one being the smallest, made up of the tormentors, the cowards, and the ones who used their evil efforts to push us out. She said they spat on us, kicked us, pushed us into lockers and downstairs. She then noted that the second group was made up of students who sympathized with the 9. Though they never really said anything, you could see it in their eyes that said, "Sorry this is happening to you." Finally, what she noted as the largest and most impacting group were the ones that remained silent through this abuse. For their bravery, grace, determination, and history that they made, the members of Little Rock 9 received the NAACP's Spingarn Medal in 1958. On May 27, 1958, the eldest member of the Little Rock 9, Ernest Green, becomes the first black student to ever graduate from Central High School, making a historical mark in the fight for equality for black people. Then, in September of 1958, a bitter Governor Faubus signs a recently passed law that allowed him to close public schools in Little Rock, forcing all students in attendance to study elsewhere. However, in June of 1959, a federal court rules that these actions taken by Faubus were unconstitutional, which forces him to reopen schools affected by this law. For its contribution to the efforts of desegregation, in 1982, Little Rock High School is named to the National Register of Historic Places for their successful integration. On November 9, 1999, all members of the Little Rock 9 received the Congressional Gold Medal. In the August of 2005, sculptures in their likeness are dedicated on the grounds of the Arkansas State Capitol. It's important to know the story of the Little Rock 9 because it was a significant turning point in the civil rights movement. Black people began being taken seriously, and serious changes within society were being made to help uplift the African American community. This group of young black minds didn't know that they would be making history when they stepped through those doors of Central High School. At that time, they were just kids. However, they became a symbol of hope that change was possible. Though their time at Central wasn't easy, they all went on to discuss their experiences and shed light on just how scary and violent racism and prejudice can be. Those 9 young students were the determined minds of the future. And now that the proper changes have been made, it's up to us to keep fighting for what's right.